I have one small announcement. That is at 10:45 we will go and take the official conference photo. So we just go from here. That's after the talk by O'Brien. And it's a pleasure to announce or to introduce Corina E Tarnita, who is at Princeton University and will give a talk about mathematics of social behavior.
All right. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for coming and thanks for having me here. So I'm giving another talk on Thursday. So I took an approach, kind of like Joshua's approach, to have something today that's more like a review of mathematics of social behavior, place it in a bit of a historical context, and talk about some more recent things and a bit of my research. But the bulk of the research, I guess, is on Thursday. So, okay. Does everyone here know what a mathematical biologist is? Do you know the joke? Anyone know the joke? How many people know the joke so I know whether I should tell it? Thomas said I should tell it to test the mood of the audience. All right, so what's a mathematical biologist? I even had a picture of it, so maybe I should, but I don't have it. Now, so a mathematical biologist is taking a stroll through the mountains. So I'm originally from Romania. Let's assume we're in the Romanian mountains. And runs into a shepherd with many, many sheep. And he says, shepherd, if I guess how many sheep you have, can I get one? So the shepherd has been there for a while by himself, kind of bored out of his mind, so he obviously wants to play this game. He says, sure, go ahead. You have 243 sheep. Wow, that's really impressive. That's really impressive. Sure, you can get your prize. So the mathematician goes, and then the shepherd says, hold on, if I guess your profession, can I have my animal back? Sure, of course. You're a mathematical biologist. How did you know? That's amazing. Because you picked up my dog. So I guess a mathematical biologist, good. So it's early in the morning, but still. So a mathematical biologist, I guess, we count the right things, maybe not always the right ways, but we're certainly not always clear what we're counting, I guess is the moral of that joke. So what about the mathematics of evolution first, before we get to social evolution? So the mathematics of evolution have these three ingredients. You have to have a population that evolves, right? So you have to have a population of individuals. And then you have to have reproduction. You have to have selection, so that if you have different types that reproduce at different rates, then you could have selection that occurs between these two types. And in order to get types, so in order to get variation, you must have mutation. And so these are errors during reproduction, and you can implement them in different ways. You can mutate from A to B, from B to A, or only in one direction. So you can get creative with all of these. But in principle, these are the three main ingredients that we need: reproduction, selection, and mutation. And so that's for the mathematics of evolution. And so far here, I didn't discuss anything about any frequency dependence, which is what I hinted to a little bit yesterday. So far, when I said A reproduces at rate little a, B reproduces at rate little b, it doesn't matter to A if there's B in the population or the other way around. So why would we need to account for that? Because I argue, and not just me, that social behavior is intrinsically frequency dependent. So when you have interactions with others, that's going to influence your fitness. And so somehow we want our equations to actually capture that. And to give you a more clear sense of why you might care, like how fitness actually depends on others' choices, we'll play a little game. It's called the Keynesian Beauty Contest. It's not a beauty contest. This is John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, came up with this game, also known as 2/3 of the average. So I'm going to ask you, we're not actually going to play the full-blown version of it, but basically what I would ask if we were to play it is to pick a number between 0 and 100. And I would collect all those numbers, and then I'd calculate the average of this room, and I'd take 2/3 of the average. And the winner is the person who comes closest to 2/3 of this average. Does that make sense? So you all have to pick numbers independently, but between 0 and 100, you can't talk to each other or so on. And then the winner is the one who comes closest to guessing what, it doesn't have to be 2/3, it could be guess the average or guess half of the average. Andy.
Shouldn't the average, like if you have a big enough group, always come to 50? So you know that 2/3 of the average is, well, I'm not a mathematician to know what 2/3 of 50 are, but you should be close, right?
Yeah, so you think the average should be at 2/3 of the 50, that would be 33. What if everyone thinks that?
I mean, if you have a close enough group, don't you get to 50 by like just statistics?
So let's take a moment. I just give everyone a moment to actually think about what numbers they would pick. So you can pick any number, but you have a purpose here. You want to get the closest to 2/3 of the average, right? So does anyone want to tell me a number that they would choose?
12.
0.
Okay, some zeros at 12. Annie would go with 50. Well, 2/3 of 50, which would be 33.
How long do you give people to think about it before they have to choose their number?
I don't know.
So you know
probably like
that
5
the
minutes.
outcome is 33, so you need to pick 2/3 of 33.
Exactly. So that's exactly how it goes, right? So you don't know who you're playing with. This is a room of people that you've never played this game before with. So someone picked 12, other people picked 0. You would have picked 50 maybe initially, right? Or 33. Someone else would pick, right? So we know if you analyze this game, if we play it long enough, everyone should play 0. That's the only equilibrium of this game. Because the more you go through these rounds, the more you realize that you should get closer and closer to 0. Everyone should play 0. But not everyone plays 0 when you are in a crowd. Even if I played in class with my 17 students last year, I played it and the average was 14. You would have been very close. and I bet here it would be around 12, so you would win reproduction in this round. Anyway, so if we look at how people play in general, so this is how people do it, let's say in the lab. Quite a few people, they play the game, you know, there will be people, you know, so 50 would be the average if people played quite random. And clearly there are some people who play quite random, so there's someone who picked 100. Even though clearly 100 shouldn't be in there because, right? And then you have kind of everywhere, there's been some guesses, but most people are at 33 or 22. So you can clearly see those peaks. If you played then with an even larger population to see what happens, so people played it with newspaper readers, and I guess these are German newspapers. There are probably smart German newspapers with smart readers. I don't know them, but I guess that's Financial Times. Because they have a lot of zeros, right? All of a sudden, unlike the people in the lab, here we have a population that actually most of these three, 22, 33, and 0 is the one that's picked the most. And here you have a very, very flat distribution. And then you might ask, so what if we played with game theorists? You know, what if we played with experimenters? They know the answer should be 0. So this is a population that you'd think should faster pick or should converge to 0 much easily. Yeah, it turns out that's not the case. You even have the odd game theorist who picks 100. But given, you know, these are economists, it's unclear whether this one didn't understand the game or is just trying to screw everyone else. But in principle, there are a lot more zeros. But as you can see, the point of this game is to show that no matter how much you try to understand it as an equilibrium kind of game, when you play it with people that you've never met before or that you've never played it before with, it's very hard to optimize anything, right? You can just kind of guess how many levels of thinking about the game does every person do in that particular population. But even like game theorists don't get it quite right from the beginning. Anyway, so that's a motivation for why, in principle, frequency dependence matters. How many people played what is what will affect the winner. So you can't really optimize by just thinking yourself. All right, so game theory started in the Second World War. It actually started at Princeton by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern. And they were interested in developing the theory of strategic decision making, right? World War II. So that gave rise to game theory. And then several decades later, John Nash contributed, had very important contributions with his Nash equilibrium. So the kind of game that economists would study is called the prisoner's dilemma, and it's inspired by the interaction between two prisoners. So imagine that two people committed a crime, and they're now thrown in jail. and the police don't have enough evidence to put them in jail, both of them. So they're trying to like divide and conquer. So they're putting them in different rooms and they're telling them if you snitch on the other person, you can go out free and the other person will get all the penalties. So that would be, this would be these scenarios. When one of them remains silent, the other one and gets out free and the other one gets 20 years. The problem is that if they both defect on each other, so when they both confess, they both get 5 years. There's enough evidence to put them in jail for 5 years. If they both remain silent, there's only very little evidence, you know, and they'll be only in jail for 1 year. So the temptation here, the best outcome for them would be to remain silent, clearly. But the temptation is to defect on each other because you never know if you both remain, if the other one confesses, you're in this very bad situation that you get 20 years, and then so they both confess and they end up with 5 years each. And so to make that in a more abstract and without prisoners, you can think that a cooperator is someone who pays a cost for someone else to get a benefit. And a defector is someone who pays no cost but can reap the benefits of an interaction with a cooperator. And we can put that into a matrix form. So in red is what you get. So if you cooperate and I cooperate, then you get B minus C, and I also get B minus C. We both pay the cost, we both get the benefits. If you cooperate and I defect, you get minus C, okay? And I get the benefit. If you defect and I cooperate, you get B. And if we both defect, we both get 0, okay? So no matter, so if you look at this matrix, if I cooperate, then if you defect against me, you get B. If you cooperate against me, you get B minus C. And B is greater than B minus C. So if I cooperate, you should always defect against me. If, on the other hand, I defect, if you defect, you get 0. And if you cooperate, you get minus C. And 0 is greater than minus C because it's a positive cost. So if I defect, you should defect. So no matter what I do in this game, even if you know what I do, or if you don't know what I do, it doesn't matter. You should always defect. That's the point of this game. And defection here is a Nash equilibrium. So why should biologists care about this game? Because in principle, the argument has been made that at every kind of evolutionary transition, like if you look at any of the major evolutionary transitions, cooperation has played some role. And maybe there are different flavors of cooperation, and one needs to understand that. But in principle, to go from single units to complexes of those single units, you need some form of alignment of interest between those units. They need to somehow become coherent, right? And so that's a form of cooperation. So whether you go, for instance, from single cells to multicellular organisms, or then from organisms to societies, animal societies, or more sophisticated human societies, there's some level of cooperation that is required. And so what I've been working on, and others, is to kind of think about the simplest, most abstract, but I don't want to say abstract in a scary kind of way, but if I want to work on microbes and I want to work on ants and I also want to work on people, what would be the essence of the mechanisms that contribute to group formation, right? So what is how can I distill that essence? So it turns out that there could be two mechanisms to go from single units to larger complexes. And that would be either some form of staying together, which is, let me give the example of multicellularity. It would be a single cell that when it divides, it doesn't fully separate from the two daughter cells don't fully separate, okay? So the wall between them becomes thicker, and so they don't fully separate. And then you start to get these chains, and then these chains can reproduce by putting out propagules, or they can break in half, or they can break in other ways. But that would be one way to achieve something bigger from smaller units. The other way would be to have aggregation, so to have actual independent individuals, and that's more like human societies, let's say, where we're all going about our business, but for some reason we are confronted with a problem and we need to solve it as a group. And so we need to come together or aggregate to solve that problem. So I would say many examples that fall in here So multicellular, a lot of examples of multicellularity would be in here, or even other kinds of societies where it's very much family-based. So it's always parents with offspring that stay at the nest. So that's a form of staying together. So this leads to either clonality in terms of multicellularity or very high forms of relatedness in the group. Here, you have individuals who simply aggregate. And so in principle, if you don't have a way to discriminate against these like green guys, so if you don't have a way to discriminate kin, then you're going to have a group that's very mixed, that can bring in a lot of interesting diversity, but that might be very hard to make into a cohesive unit. So then we can look at these two mathematically, or just stare at them, and we can ask, what kind of defection? So what would be cheats here? Well, if we look here, this is all clonal. I gave it as an example of multicellularity. What kind of defection can appear in a clonal organism? What would be one thing that's like, instead of being multicellular, it's kind of reversing its program and can destroy things for the multicellular bit?
Cancer.
Exactly. So cancer is an example here, right? So it's a cell that's reverting in some sense to being multicellular, to being single cellular. It's not obeying any of the rules of the multicellular organism. So in some sense, defection here is cancer, which is a bit boring. Not that cancer is boring, but that here a lot more things can happen. So you can get a lot of different genotypes with a lot of interesting ways of exploiting each other that are much harder to regulate. Here, this turns out to be a problem where you in order to avoid cancer, you have to control your mutation rate, let's say, right? So it's part of a developmental program that if it optimizes the mutation rate and it doesn't get these cancerous cells too often, then that should be, in principle, easier to control. Here, it's a much more, it's in some sense a trickier situation. So, and then you can look further, and so this staying together is discussed in terms of, usually it comes with a unicellular bottleneck, some sort of point where you have a big complex, and then it makes propagules that start the next generation. And when that happens, even if this had some bad cells in there, now the bad cells are on their own, and they can't really do very much. And the good cells are on their own, but the good cells on their own, they can actually start the whole thing all over again. So this unicellular bottleneck, in the case of staying together, can give this kind of like a way of filtering defectors. In the aggregation type, if you have a way to recognize defectors or recognize non-kin, then you can exclude them. If you can't exclude them, then you're kind of stuck with whatever is in there, and you have to make it work or not. So if we look at origins of multicellularity, and so here I have in red all the ones that have arisen by staying together, and not in red the ones that have aggregation. And I'd like to exclude the fungi, which I find them hugely complicated, and so maybe we'll leave those for a different time. But everything else, and so this is from John Bonner's review of origins of multicellularity. And so the interesting thing is that if you look at the eukarya, they are dominated by staying together. And also, if you want to think that humans and plants are very complex, then this kind of staying together has also led to the most complexity. But I'm kind of trying to be careful with that name, because I think bacteria, which are overwhelmingly aggregates, are also quite complex, but in different dimensions. So, so this is just to show that a lot of the origins of staying together or a lot of the eukaryotes are staying together. A lot of the prokaryotes form aggregations. But the interesting question is, there are two interesting questions. First of all, if you've discovered one way of doing it versus the other, or is there something that makes eukarya much more likely to do staying together versus bacteria? That would be one question. Is there something physiological that makes this difference? And the second question would be, once you've achieved multicellularity via one way or the other, is there, what kind of frontiers are you going to discover? Like what kind of ways can you evolve into with one type of mechanism versus the other? It turns out that if you look physiologically, anything here can do both, actually. You'll see a lot of bacteria, which most often do biofilms, which are more or less like aggregates. You'll see them often growing filaments, so they can do staying together, like E. coli can grow filaments. Similarly, you can take something like insect societies, which are these huge societies, a mother and their daughters, and so let's say wasps. And so they're known for this great eusociality that they have, that they achieve via staying together. But at the same time, you can also find other species of wasps that just come together every once in a while. They're called communal wasps. They're unrelated. They solve some problem at a certain time in the season, and then they're kind of by themselves. So it seems to me that physiologically there's no a priori difference, which means that in order to understand the origin of multicellularity, we really need to compare both and try to understand the ecological conditions that have selected for one versus the other. So just to recap, multicellularity via staying together allows for interactions with identical clones. It's the whole control of defection can be part of a developmental program that evolved in the first cell. And in addition, you have this unicellular bottleneck or some sort of modularity that can filter out defection. When is aggregation useful? When might that occur, ecologically speaking? Well, it could be when the ecological demands require groups that are large and have to happen all of a sudden, like very quickly. Okay? If that's the case, it'll be very hard to grow from one cell. You have to grow your thing that has to have 10 to the 9 cells, right? It'll take too much time. So if you need things that are large and quickly formed, and if it's either the number of available relatives is too low or you can't identify them, then you might need to do aggregation with whoever is around you. So one example would be these tree-killing beetles, and I know this is a microbes conference, but I will have an example from microbes also. So it's a very similar one. So tree-killing beetles, they want to get to a tree, they want to lay eggs inside the bark of the tree. They kind of destroy the bark, which means they kill the tree. If only one beetle goes there, the tree produces resin or latex, and it can completely suffocate and kill the bug. But if 10,000 beetles come all at once, that completely overwhelms the defenses of the tree, and there's nothing that they can do. So that's why beetles secrete pheromones to attract conspecifics, whether they are related or not, and just do the attack together. Okay, so that would be a place where it makes sense. Similarly, if you think about bacteria that become virulent only when they are at very high numbers, they do kind of the same thing, right? If few of them are in the body, the immune system could in principle clear them. But when they're at very large numbers, which is why they do the quorum sensing, the signaling and the quorum sensing, to figure out if they have enough quorum and then become virulent. So very similar kind of example. And so most biofilms are actually examples of aggregation. If they have no kin discrimination, so if they're not clonal, then I call them true aggregation, because really if they have kin discrimination, they end up being clonal. They're almost the same thing as staying together. It doesn't really matter as much. And in the biofilm process, we talk a lot about these things called public goods games. And so I'll just give very quick examples. So these are problems where this kind of game theoretic approach has been more recently employed in microbes. In the whole talk, I'll put it in a historical perspective because the applications to microbes are recent and also sometimes problematic. But just to give a sense of where they might apply. So for instance, signaling for quorum sensing. If you have a bacterium, they all need the signal, right? And so we heard this already 2 days ago, but they need to know how many bacteria are there. If all of them signal a little bit, then it's great. It's a very reliable assessment of the quorum. But if the signal is costly, then there is an incentive, or imagine a mutant bacteria that doesn't produce the signal, right? Then you still have 1 billion of them that produce the signal, so that's fine. The quorum is still roughly correct, right? But the bacterium that doesn't pay the cost will reproduce more than the others. And so soon enough, you'll have more bacteria or lots of bacteria that don't produce the signal. Now the quorum won't work anymore, right? So that's how defection kind of ruins these kinds of public goods. So the signal is a public good because they all use it. All the bacteria have access to it and can use it in exactly the same way. Similarly, if you want to produce matrix when you form biofilm, so you can have, if matrix production is costly, then there may be bacteria like in Paul Rainey's Pseudomonas fluorescens, they form a mat, everyone has to contribute to the mat, but soon enough you see these mutant cells that don't produce the matrix, and they reproduce a lot on top of the mat, and they sink everyone else. So these are the public goods problems where it kind of matters who's in the population, and you could, in principle, have these defectors that can try to destroy the public good. But one has to be very careful to really identify whether these are really public goods problems. And so I think Paul can talk more about that. Okay, so the many more interesting kinds of parasites, if you want, or cheats might come when you can actually aggregate with anything else, any other kind of genotype or any other species, as long as you have some way of agreeing on how to do it, right? So there could be mechanistic ways that actually prevent you from aggregating with anything out there. You just don't have the same adhesion, or you adhere at different rates, and so Sylvia de Monde is going to talk about that. But in principle, if you manage to aggregate, and you don't exclude others based on the fact that they're not kin, you could have a lot of diverse genotypes playing the same game. So tomorrow I'll talk about Dictyostelium discoideum and the research that I'm doing there because, and so the reason that I think Dictyostelium is a very good example of multicellularity that is achieved via aggregation, which is true aggregation, is the following. So these are slime molds, they're amoebae, they're soil living amoebae. They live alone, they live like independent of each other, they're single cellular as long as they have food. When they starve, they start to aggregate. As a result of the aggregate, they form a mound. The mound turns into some form of slug that's perfectly, like it has a clear boundary from the outside, so it's enveloped in some sort of sheath. And this one can do chemotaxis or phototaxis until it finds the right conditions where it can reproduce, where it can then form this fruiting body that has a stalk and spores. So the stalk is formed of 20% of the cells commit suicide to produce this sturdy stalk, and then 80% of the cells go and form the spores. So it's clearly that there's like very sophisticated, it has a single cellular life stage, it has a multicellular life stage, and it's a sophisticated multicellular life stage because it has basically cell differentiation. You have like germ soma differentiation. The part that's very neat from my perspective is that these don't have kin discrimination. So they can aggregate with other genotypes. They can even aggregate with other species to the point where they're still compatible. And so if you go out in the wild and you collect, such fruiting bodies from various locations, about 10% of them will be chimeras, meaning that they have at least one genotype. So how is that then, having this kind of germ soma differentiation, how does that work with allowing all these other individuals to, or all these other different genotypes to aggregate with you, is, I think, an interesting question to explore. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But today, I'm going to talk about when we have these aggregates. So we know that there are some groups. What kind of mechanisms maintain cooperation in such groups? So two people have done, in my opinion, early on, these like crucial contributions to get people started to think about this. So this is Bill Hamilton, who in 1964 wrote a very important paper. Part of the idea is attributed to JBS Haldane, so we'll take this whole thing as a combination of their ideas. I think Bill Hamilton said he didn't know about Haldane, but Haldane's quote says, I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. So in some sense, because my 2 brothers have the same genes, like half of I'm sharing half of my genes with each of my brothers, then my genes shouldn't care that the genes come in a package that's me or my two brothers. So in principle, I should be driven to save 2 plus a little bit of two brothers, just to make it make sense, or 8 plus a little bit of cousins. And so Hamilton suggested that interactions, and I think this is the important contribution, that interactions are unlikely to occur with random individuals. So individuals are most likely to interact with kin who share the same genes. And in this case, a cooperative act might provide indirect benefits. So somehow, if I'm conferring some benefits on some random individual, that's really not, is very unlikely to come back to me. But if I'm conferring them on my brother or cousin, that's indirectly positively affecting my genes, or could negatively if I'm affecting them negatively. Similarly, at roughly similar times, John Maynard Smith and George Price worked out on this proposed this idea of evolutionary game theory. And so evolutionary game theory is a way of thinking about evolution at a phenotypic level when the fitnesses of particular phenotypes depend on their frequencies in the population. So if you want to compare the two, if you have something like evolution of wing form, that's something that a bird has to optimize for itself. It'll be some trial and error. It doesn't depend what really the other bird's wings are like. But if you want to look at like dispersal behavior in soaring birds, then it matters what the other birds are doing. You should do what they're doing, otherwise you won't have anyone to mate with wherever you disperse. So they gave these two examples, and so now instead of analyzing the game like economists, what should this individual do when they're playing the game against another individual, now we don't have rational individuals. In evolutionary game theory, we never deal with rational individuals, so that we can apply it to bacteria just as much as people. And so rationality is replaced by population dynamics. So now we have a large population of individuals, all of them playing the same game. And instead of being self-interested individuals, they're individuals that are reproducing in a Darwinian sense, so they have some sort of fitness. So you have a population of individuals that play the game, and you reproduce proportional to how well you're doing. So the higher the payoff you get by playing whatever strategy you're playing, the more offspring you're going to have in the next generation. And that's how you play it without necessarily thinking that the individuals themselves are optimizing something, but that natural selection is the one that's doing the selection, the optimization in some sense. Okay, so when you take just, now you take your population of individuals and you say, okay, let's not analyze it as economists do. Let's analyze a population of cooperators. I put a defector in there, let them play the game, and let's see what natural selection does. And these are random interactions, so we're not thinking about Hamilton yet. What you get in the end is a population of defectors. So it doesn't matter whether we do it in a static analysis, kind of the typical economist way, or we do it with evolutionary game theory. In a well-mixed population, there is no way for cooperation to emerge or to persist. So the question is, regardless of how high the benefit or how low the cost of the cooperation, there is no way to get it to persist. Because the defector will always have a higher payoff, and it'll just reproduce more, and so eat the resources more and replace everyone else. So what are the mechanisms that can promote cooperation in such a population? So there are very simple ones that are more less relevant, I guess, to microbes, so I'm going to go through them very quickly. Here's Robert Trivers, and he talked about reciprocity. So one way to do it is, if we have only one interaction, then it makes no sense for you to ever cooperate with me. But if we see each other here every day, we'd be kind of silly to not figure out a way to cooperate, right? Because we would get higher benefits if we managed to cooperate. So one way to do it is to say, I cooperate with you if you cooperate with me. And so the winning strategy is a tit-for-tat-like strategy, one that mirrors exactly what you did previously. You cooperated with me, I will cooperate with you. You start defecting with me, I will defect against you. And so you can find that even in things like monkeys, the way they groom each other. And you can also have indirect reciprocity, where it's like I help someone hoping that someone else will help me. And you see this in animal societies also, like vampire bats and so on. This is the Good Samaritan. So the idea in human populations would be that there's some sort of reputation system, that I know Thomas is a nice person, and I tell this to Andy, and so Andy will know to cooperate with Thomas. Okay? And so that is based, hopefully on a reliable gossiping system, which gossip is gossip, it's not reliable, so this is hard to implement. But in principle, there is such a thing as a reputation, and people do use that for things like indirect reciprocity. Okay. Now we get to the ones that do not require cognition, and I think are more relevant to microbes. The one that I've worked on most is spatial games. So when your interactions are not at random, but they are with your neighbors on some sort of network. And so here is actually a plate of bacteria that are stained. Actually, I think this is Vibrio cholera. And they're stained with different colors, and you can see that they grow. They're inoculated with like one cell of each color, but when they grow, you start to see these clonal patches and then borders with other clonal patches of other colors and so on. So this is space. They're not moving very much. So what they're creating is basically a clustering with other individuals that are as they are. And you can find some rules for when the benefit to cost, for how high the benefit needs to be. And I'll talk about that in a second. But that's the principle, that as long as you somehow interact with individuals who are like you, cooperators are more likely to interact with cooperators. So this is a Bob May, Martin Novak paper from '91, where they tried to come up with various ways on a lattice of how they reproduce and where the offspring go and so on. And I think the authors got a little bit creative here. You probably won't see your bacteria doing most of these. Let's imagine something like this, which is, I guess, the most realistic. What you see, so in blue are the cooperators, in red the defectors. So you can have a lot of defectors. They can still be doing really, like being, you can be in a sea of defectors. But these cooperators that manage to be in some clusters of cooperation, they are going to be protected. They're going to do very well inside those clusters. So to give a very quick sense of exactly how that works, if we think about a linear process, so how do we think about, how does actually, when you have a well-mixed population, someone dies, someone reproduces, everyone is everywhere, so you don't really have to have a recipe about where the offspring go and who dies and so on. But when you actually have a structure, you have choices. So they're usually called the Moran process, with either death-birth or birth-death updating. And what does that mean? Well, it means the following: the death-birth updating. So if we want to make, how does death happen, how does birth happen, and we want a very simple process where you keep the same population size throughout your process, then you say, okay, well, death should occur first. And let's say that this individual is picked for death, and death should occur at random, just to make things simple. Everyone here has the same chance of dying. Let's say this one died. Then the neighbors are competing with each other, only with each other, to reproduce in the empty spot. Okay, so that would be death-birth updating. Birth-death updating would be that now all the individuals in the population would compete for reproduction proportional to how well they're doing. So this is an individual-based model, by the way, speaking of what we were doing yesterday. I care about stochasticity here, and individuals reproduce differently. So I pick someone to reproduce proportional to their payoff in the game. And so let's say this one wins. And then the offspring kills at random one of the neighbors, displaces at random one of the neighbors. That would be birth-death updating. Okay? So then when you do it like this, either death or birth, everything happens very locally. So you interact with your neighbors, and when you reproduce, you put your offspring nearby. So if you're a defector, you're going to surround yourself with defectors, and if you're a cooperator, you're going to surround yourself with cooperators, and you're going to have some benefit that you get out of interacting with a cooperator, with so many other cooperators next to you. Okay, so spatial selection helps because then if you have a cluster, right? Let's assume that there's a cluster here. So there are some cooperators here, there are some defectors here. And now what matters is not so much what's going on here, not so much what's going on here, but the question is who pushes the boundary in what direction? Are the cooperators going to push into the defector population, or the defectors going to push into the cooperator population? So those are the kinds of questions we ask. So it's like the biggest battle is actually given at the borders, right? So it's like at the borders of these clusters is where the interesting stuff is happening. Okay, so so that would be spatial clustering, and you can have, and this can be, you know, like actual birth-death processes in biology. They could be imitation processes in kind of cultural evolution, if you care about cultural evolution. Okay, so going back to kin selection, and this is what Hamilton started. This is, so the rule for cooperation to evolve, the very simple Hamilton's rule, if you've heard of Hamilton's rule, is that the benefit times the relatedness has to exceed the cost for cooperation to evolve. Okay? So this has a very simple, so people take this as a very general, but in fact this is derived for two individuals. So imagine that you have two individuals, and this one is the actor. It has to decide whether to cooperate or not. And this one would be the beneficiary, and the relatedness between the two of these is R. Okay? So what is the, so I'm giving a benefit to this person who's related R to me, and I'm paying a cost. So overall, on the balance, what am I losing and what am I getting? Well, I'm paying the cost C, but because this guy is related by R with me, or has relatedness R, let's say 1/2, then I actually get back something by helping those genes, and so part of my benefit I get back, and exactly what part where I get R of it. So like I get half of it, as if I saved my brother, right? So as long as this is positive, intuitively I should help the other person at this cost and that benefit. Okay, so that's the derivation for two individuals, and this is for two individuals. If you have more individuals, you'll just have different relatedness with each one of them, so you'll get a more complicated rule. Okay, so what about it? So this is a little bit complicated because things get a little bit murky here. Kin selection is not actually a term that Hamilton came up with. It's a term that Maynard Smith coined, and they didn't get along very well on this whole theme. So, and the definition of kin selection has become a very complicated and often mistaken one. So the one that I found by asking theoreticians, like if you talk to Peter Taylor or if you look at papers of Stu West and Andy Gardner, the definition would be kin selection is a process by which traits change in frequency over evolutionary time, in part because of their effects on the fitness of related individuals. Okay? So it's not a mechanism. It's a process. How, judging by this definition, how common do you think this process is? I would say very common, right? Extremely common. Most of the time, at least part of your interactions are going to be with related individuals, where relatedness here could mean actual relatedness, or could mean people who think like you, if you want to think about, so any kind of tag, right? And that will affect your traits if you have this kind of frequency dependence. So that's a very general, it's exactly kind of the Hamiltonian idea. Interactions are not at random. And so if they're not at random, then kin selection occurs. That does not mean that cooperation should also occur. So that's why it's very important. Just because kin selection occurs, that doesn't, we've just learned that interactions are not at random. Basically, this is what it's saying. But often mistakenly, and I don't mean any slight to Freeman and Heron, this is just a book that was being used at Princeton to teach evolution, to teach evolutionary biology. You can often find mistaken, much more narrow definitions that kind of hint to the idea of a mechanism. So you could read things like natural selection favoring the spread of alleles that increase the indirect component of fitness is called kin selection, right? Okay, so here it's a very positive, right? It's like natural selection that's acting, and it's increasing those alleles that positively affect the indirect components of fitness, right? So this is a much more narrow one. And so it's what I've discovered is that biologists often, some use the first one, some use the second one, but think that they're talking about the same thing, which can lead to a lot of confusion. But most I will actually stick with the theoreticians' take on it, which makes this a very general process. So then what is inclusive fitness? Well, inclusive fitness is a quantity, like fitness, okay? It's a quantity that was introduced by Hamilton in 1964 to capture both the direct effects that an action has on myself, and that would be the minus C, and the indirect effects, and that would be the B times R, okay? So what is this inclusive fitness? This is the definition that Hamilton gave, and it looks a little bit scary, but it actually makes sense. So it says inclusive fitness may be imagined as the personal fitness which an individual actually expresses in its production of adult offspring as it becomes after it has been first stripped and then augmented in a certain way. It is stripped of all components which can be considered as due to the individual's social environment, leaving the fitness which he would express if not exposed to any of the harms or benefits of that environment. So it's excluding all your interactions, basically, except the one that matters, except this one cooperative event. And then this quantity is then augmented by certain fractions of the quantities of harm and benefit which the individual himself causes to the fitnesses of his neighbors. And those fractions are the relatedness coefficients, so I won't read that part. But basically what it's saying is that the way we look at fitness is there are some interactions, many interactions, you get some offspring. And those are your offspring. Here they are for red and here they are for blue. Inclusive fitness says, okay, well, indeed, those are the fitness offsprings, but what I care about is not all of them. I just want to throw away everything that doesn't have to do with this particular action, okay? So I only take the amount of offspring, positive or negative, so here it's minus C, it's negative, so I lose some offspring, that is due to this particular action. And then I take my sister's offspring, and I don't take all her offspring, because I'm not responsible for all her offspring, just the part that she gets because of positive interactions with me. And so then I take that, and that becomes the inclusive fitness. And now you can write it for any number of individuals. So I pay some cost for everyone, and then this inclusive fitness effect is written as a lot of like minus C plus a lot of benefits times relatedness for everyone that I'm interacting with. Okay, so this was, and I thought I'd have time to get into this, but the poster child of like applying the inclusive fitness ideas and the kin selection ideas was to explain why there are ants that don't reproduce. Okay, so why are there sterile ants? And this is this form of social behavior that's called eusociality. And so Hamilton came up with the haplodiploid hypothesis that said that in haplodiploid species, it turns out that sisters are more related to each other than mothers are to daughters. So if you look at haplodiploid species, this means the mother is diploid, the father is haploid. Whenever they mate to make a son, the mother just makes a copy of herself. So like takes one part of her of her chromosome, and then to create a daughter, it makes an egg that gets fertilized. So it's a little bit of a complicated system, but it turns out that relatedness between mother and daughter is 1/2. Between two sisters, it's 2/3. No, 3/4, sorry. It's 3/4. The relatedness between, and we can calculate it. So the relatedness between two sisters is 3/4. So then it makes more sense. You're more related to your sisters than you are to your daughters, so it would make more sense to help your mother. But first of all, a lot more species were discovered that weren't haplodiploid, and nevertheless they had this very fancy kind of sociality. And theoretically also it turns out that yes, you're more related to the sisters, but you're less related to the brothers, so that on average you're related to everyone 1/2. So it's kind of like a diploid system, but just in a different way, arranging the relatedness with the offspring. So this kind of fell as the poster child. And you know, I've done some work, we've done some work to think about that. But in principle, let me finalize by talking about what I think about inclusive fitness and what I think about kin selection in the end. So there are some problems with inclusive fitness, which you can immediately see from the definition. One problem is that it assumes that all the effects are additive, right? So that I can look at everyone in the population and I can say, I just talked to Rosalind yesterday. This means 1% of her offspring belong to me. I mean, not really, but like, we're not related. Right, so it means that I can partition these things, which is very hard, basically impossible. Things are not linear like that, they're not additive. So if you think about like a very simple example of, we want to, I'll give a human example. I won't even try a microbe example with this one, but so assume that, my brother is drowning and I can't save him by myself, and my sister and I save him together, and we managed to do it. And now he has 3 kids. How do you divide the 3 kids between the 2 of us, right? Neither of us could have saved him independently. We had to work synergistically to do it, so there's no way to split the kids in half, right? So it's very hard to actually partition. Even if selection is weak and you linearize everything in every way, there are synergistic effects that will matter and will complicate things. And the other part of the problem is that usually it looks simpler because you can measure relatedness. You can say, well, at least I can measure something. In this very complicated life that we have to measure, we can see that things are related and we can measure how related. The problem that I'm arguing is that it's very complicated to keep track of how effects propagate in a population. So if I give a little bit of benefit here at a certain cost, who knows who else I'm affecting somewhere out there, right? So I'll give you another one of my human examples, and this is, imagine that my cousin is drowning. My family hates this talk. So imagine that my cousin is drowning, and this time he's smaller, so I can save him by myself. And he goes on and he has 3 children, and now I'm very happy, I've increased my inclusive fitness. But what I don't know is that he's competing with my brother for the same woman. And now my brother is scorned in love, he's never going to marry again, and he has no children. If I hadn't saved my cousin, my brother would have had those 3 children. I would have gotten more relatedness out of it, right? So in some sense, keeping track of exactly like all the other competitions that happen in a population affecting one individual can propagate very far. By the time you have all this information, you kind of have the information about everything in the system. So is inclusive fitness necessary? Well, it turns out that you don't get anything extra from it. Whatever you can derive with inclusive fitness, you can also derive it from fitness. Inclusive fitness came just from a desire to kind of say that there should be an optimization function, some function that gets maximized when a certain behavior is made. But we know that things aren't necessarily maximized in evolution. And so most often inclusive fitness actually cannot be defined because of all these synergistic effects and non-weak selection and so on. And when it can be defined, it actually provides an alternative accounting method, like absolutely alternative. You just look at certain terms and you call them relatedness or spatial clustering. So that's where there may be some, so is it useful? Yes, it's useful if intuitively it helps you to reinterpret certain things in terms of relatedness between individuals rather than spatial clustering of a form or another. And what about Hamilton's rule? Well, same problems, and so this is actually from Stan Leibler's group. They created a synthetic microbial system where they tried to calculate the benefits and the costs and the relatedness and so on. And they found that the benefits and the costs are hugely nonlinear. This is not weak selection with bacteria. So you can't really put them in any kind of form that looks like that. And so often this leaves it as a rule of thumb where you just kind of look at the systems and try to guess something based on how related individuals are. But we can come up with examples like this linear example that I showed you there. So if you look in a well-mixed population, large well-mixed population, relatedness is 0 between individuals, and there's no cooperation. If you now look at the linear process with death-birth versus birth-death updating, relatedness between interacting individuals is 1, so it's highly related system. But with death-birth updating, we get cooperation very cheaply actually. With birth-death updating, we never get it. So you can have very minor differences, even in simple models, can make all the difference in the world with the same relatedness. So, or same outcome with very different relatedness. So what I guess would be a conclusion is that Hamilton's great contribution, in my opinion, was to realize that interactions were most likely to not occur with random individuals, but with related individuals. And I put related in quotes because you could think of individuals that are, my academic mentor, I'm related to him in some way, kind of culturally. And then that kind of, he thought that whatever achieves this kind of setup, whether it's recognition, whether it's limited dispersal, whether it is space and whatever, could provide the conditions under which cooperation can be possible. And this is true, and I think that's what kin selection is. When you see that there's high relatedness in something that's occurring, that means cooperation could happen there. For the same reason it happens in spatial structures, because there is clustering of like individuals. To that end, as a heuristic, Hamilton's rule and relatedness measurements remain an important first tool, in my opinion, in how to address social behavior. However, there's no way to get any kind of rigorous conclusion or prediction for a particular system without a complete description, like model and measurements, of your actual system, right? So this is like a general principle, and then this is something where you actually have to do it, and these conditions can be met, and sometimes you can get cooperations and sometimes you can't. So it'll depend very much on actually rigorously doing. So the heuristic won't work that far. And I won't get into multi-level selection, I have one more slide, but I think I should take questions at this point, unless there are questions about multi-level selection, in which case I'll leave that slide up there. But in the meantime, I'll leave this one about the horrors of math.
Thank you very much. Time for questions.
Oh.
If it comes to biofilms and aggregation biofilms, I think it's usually that biofilms formed by clonal growth of founder cells into microcolonies. And most of the experiments using red or green labeled cells, which are genetically identical otherwise, show that the biofilm structure is really formed by clonal growth rather than aggregation. If you're talking about a population of the same species forming a biofilm, a natural biofilm, obviously with many species, is a different story, where you have a mixture of different colonies from different species. Then these are really different species or not different clones. So unless you have some kind of twitching motility or other motility in the biofilm that can redistribute cells, you get clonal microcolonies in the biofilm.
I completely agree, except, and this is what we observe in Dictyostelium, right? So so this is how they'll grow, right? They'll grow like some part of, you put them colored of different colors, and it'll grow some here, and then some more here, and so on. And so, yes, most of the time here, these will form a biofilm that's clonal. These will form a biofilm that's clonal. These also. But there are boundaries. If at those boundaries, there's no way to discriminate between the two colors, there will be interactions at the boundaries. So with Dictyostelium, we observe that at the boundaries, they form fruiting bodies that are chimeric. Everywhere else, like 90% of the rest of the space, because of limited motility, they are clonal. But at the boundary, that's the question that it's like usually, it's hard to know, right? And it's so overwhelming that you see everything is like patchy, that it's unclear. So something like Vibrio cholera has no interaction at the border with anything else. It doesn't allow anything else. But something like Dictyostelium does. So that's the...
Yes, Dictyostelium, sure, you're right.
Yeah.
About a week ago or so, a paper in Nature was published describing group selection. I really don't like the term group selection. Do you still think I thought it could be described as frequency dependence. Do you feel like group selection is a term that's still got use or merit?
Right, so thank you. I can go to my... right, so this is a little bit hard. I don't actually see myself as working very much in multi-level selection, honestly. But it is to me, multi-level selection is a framework. It tells me that there are not just group, I want to think about it more generally, right? That there are some sort of interactions that happen locally, and then there's maybe some competition like between countries, let's say, right? It's undeniable that when there's war between two countries, it'll change the behavior of individuals in each country, right? So that kind of thing, for that to me is a framework. The fact that there are frequency-dependent interactions in there makes perfect sense. What else would there be? And so kind of what I had here is that, is multi-level selection the same thing as kin selection? No, because I just said that by the definition, kin selection is a process that incidentally can occur in the framework of multi-level selection if we take that general definition, right? There will be interactions with non-random individuals. But multi-level selection tells me something. If you tell me it model kin selection, then I won't really know exactly how to start, right? A lot of things will have kin selection. If you say, I want to think about a multi-level selection scenario, you know, then I think, oh, okay, so you want to have selection at different levels with different pressures, different strengths. So it kind of gives me a way to like build something. And so can inclusive fitness calculations be used to analyze multi-level selection models, which is maybe, I'm not aware of this paper, but I know a lot of papers like this, right? Yes, they can be used because it's an accounting method. It's like, can you do it by addition or can you do it by multiplication? You can, right? So it's an accounting method. And yes, you can do it. That doesn't mean, the way you analyze it doesn't tell you what the problem is, right? It's like, it's just a method, right? So in that sense, to me, they're not equal, and I don't even quite understand the debate. But I know that people are very committed to the debate between multi-level selection and...
Time for a last question.
So you pointed out the difference in the outcome for this one-dimensional model between birth, death, and death, birth. But both of these things are fudged to keep the number of individuals the same. So what happens when the processes are decoupled? So you have births and deaths both occurring as Poisson processes, for instance, independent of each other.
You mean, so how would you make, I mean, there are many ways to make them independent, so I just want to try to...
Yeah, so people die independently and you just delete them from the lattice and move neighbours together, and people give birth and then you spread it out. In 1D, it's easy to implement. I just wondered which side of the camp that model falls.
I don't know why I'm so thick about this right now. So do you want to not have a constant population size, or do you want like the offspring to go?
Population sizes aren't constant, right?
Yeah, they're not constant. In that sense, it's much harder to calculate it, right? So that's the reason I present it like this. But I think the principle is the same, even if it's a much larger population. You still have clusters. You still...
Right, but you said so with birth, death versus death, birth, you get a different outcome.
Yes.
And I wonder...
It will be the same.
Yeah.
So the reason that it is the same is because, look, it's what's happening at the boundary that matters. So in a birth-death process, individuals compete, individuals have to, it's only the individuals of the boundary that compete. So how does the boundary move in this direction versus this direction? It's all determined by birth. So I want this one to give birth and not this one, okay? Yeah, but this one will always have a lower payoff than this one because this guy is interacting with the cooperator, whereas this guy is interacting with the defector. So overall, this is going to be impossible to make this transition happen. In a death-birth updating, so it doesn't matter how long this thing is or what happens. In a death-birth updating, in order for the cluster to move in this direction, I want this guy to die, and I want these two guys to compete, and I want him to win. Him is likely to win against this guy because this guy is really doing poorly because it's in the middle of a cluster of defectors. So the difference between death-birth and birth-death is that in death-birth, what the rest of the cluster is doing helps you a lot. Whereas in birth-death, it's only between the two guys at the boundary, and the cooperators are never going to be favored there. So that's the main difference. And in some sense, it's like you can think about it biologically as competing with your own offspring. Like if the competition is very high between you and your brother, right? Only you can survive. You should never save your brother, right? Because it's only food for one. So that's kind of like, this is a little bit of a very abstract way of exactly capturing that. You're in the birth-death updating, you're competing too much with your own offspring or with your own relatives.
Yeah, so I think we should move on. Thank you very much.